Welcome, everyone. This session is being brought to you by the Faith Community Health Initiative at the Islamic Institute of America. The Faith Community Health Initiative is a platform where we discuss relevant health topics to equip the community with the right tools to make informed and educated decisions about their health. And today we have a very relevant health topic, and that is weight management and eating disorder. My name is Maha Alhusseini. I am an endocrinologist in private practice, and I will be speaking about the weight management part. And we also have...
My name is Yasmeen Hamdoun, and I will be talking more about the mental health aspect as it relates to weight management. I am a clinical therapist, and I currently work at the Arab American Chaldean Council. So I would like to start off with the first question, and I want to ask you, Maha, why are we talking about obesity today? Is it more about appearance, or is there more to it?
So certainly we are not talking about weight management only because of physical appearance perspective. We are talking about excess weight or obesity because it has been linked to the development of several complications such as diabetes, hypertension, and even the risk of cancer is increased in people who are overweight. So we certainly should make it a goal to maintain a healthy weight over our lifetimes so we can prevent these complications from happening in the future.
Great. And so what are some tips that you may recommend for weight loss?
So today I have 8 tips for you. They are not necessarily tips just for weight loss. They are really tips that anyone can follow in order to achieve a healthy weight over time. Because one thing that happens when we are so focused on losing weight is we start dieting and restricting ourselves, which over the long run may not be doable. And one thing that can happen when people lose weight is they go through this, what they call a yo-yo effect, which is a phase between gaining and losing. And over time, this will not help us achieve or prevent those complications that I mentioned earlier. So we want to be mindful about our daily activities so that we can make this part of our routine life. The first tip that I have for you today is a very simple one, and it is basically to eat homemade food. And when we cook our own food or someone that we know cooks it, we know exactly what the ingredients are. We know how much salt, how much sugar is in it, versus just buying food from outside most of the time. So while I am not recommending here to completely stop eating food from outside, but let's not make that a mainstay of our diet. Let's make sure that we know what we are eating. We know what we are putting into our bodies. This is my first tip. My second tip also has to do with my first one. It's related to it. It's about avoiding or minimizing the amount of processed foods that we are consuming. Nowadays, everything is processed. Even the dressing that we put on the salad is processed. If we look at our dinner tables, things like ketchup, mustard, mayo, all of these items are processed. And there is a component in these ingredients, and that is high fructose corn syrup, which is found in many processed foods. And high fructose corn syrup has been clearly linked to the development of diabetes and weight problems over time. So we need to be mindful about what we are eating. We need to go back to the basics of just making our own dressing at home and avoiding as many processed foods as we can. My third tip for you also deals with educating ourselves. And here I'm talking about educating ourselves on reading food labels. Every food item that we buy, we need to be reading the food label. Whether us as adults buy these items or even children of reading age, they need to be reading food labels. And the reason for this is because the obesity epidemic has certainly not just infiltrated the adult population, it also has infiltrated the pediatric population. So we need to be mindful about that as well.
Yeah, can I just ask a question regarding that? Because I think a lot of times the food labels can be overwhelming and there's just so much on there. So what would you advise someone, just to some basic tips about where to start, like with food labels, like knowing what's good and what's bad for you?
When it comes to reading food labels, we need to be systematic. There are certain things that we need to be looking at, but given the fact that you asked this question, I would like to share that we will be having a follow-up workshop on this session about reading food labels. We will be looking at few food items and comparing and contrasting. And this event will be open to adults as well as to children of reading age. We will be holding that in the next couple weeks, and we will post the date in the description of this session.
Oh, okay.
At the end of the video. So those were my first 3 tips for you. My 4th tip has to do with what should we be eating. I spoke about the things that we need to be avoiding. In terms of what we should be eating, when we look at nutrients, we divide them into 2 categories. We talk about the macronutrients. Those are things like carbs and fats and proteins, and this is where most of the calories come from. And then we talk about micronutrients. The micronutrients include vitamins and minerals, and those supply our cells with the necessary electrolytes to perform their daily functions. When it comes to the macronutrients, there are so many different types of diets out there, right? There is a keto diet, there's a low-carb diet, low-fat diet, there is a gluten-free diet. What else is there? There's just probably 20, 30 different diets out there.
There's some crazy ones out there.
There are also vegan diets. So which one of these diets really is the best for achieving a healthy weight? Unfortunately, in the medical community, there is no consensus on which one of these diets is best. But the one thing that there is an agreement upon is that the need to avoid artificial sugars, and sugars are part of carbs, from our diets as much as possible. So that would include things like sweet beverages, sodas, juices, desserts, even things like white bread and pasta. They have been so processed that most of their nutritious value has been stripped. And at the very molecular level, or the smallest level, they are broken down into sugar. And that will definitely increase our risk of gaining weight and having diabetes in the future. So that is something that there is an agreement upon. Now, when we talk about things like, is a low-fat diet better than a low-carb diet? The answer here really depends on who you are asking. If you ask a cardiologist, they will most likely promote a low-fat diet, because we know that diets that are high in saturated fats and bad cholesterol have been associated with developing heart disease. If you speak to an endocrinologist, like many of my colleagues, they will promote a low-carb diet, because unhealthy carbohydrates have been shown to cause obesity and diabetes. The bottom line here is that we need to be avoiding unhealthy fats and unhealthy carbs, because not all fats and all carbs are unhealthy. When it comes to protein, where should the protein source come from? Should it come from animal sources, or should it come from vegetable sources? Again, there is no consensus in the medical community about this, but from the many studies that I have looked at and reviewed, the conclusion that I have arrived at is that we should not be, or at least we are over-consuming meat products. There is no evidence to our daily practice of consuming animal products on a daily basis. So while I am not really here promoting a vegan diet, at least not yet, we certainly need to be mindful about consuming animal products on a daily basis, and perhaps just lessen the amount of consuming that on a daily basis. And staying on the subject of vegetables, we need to be including a lot of vegetables and fruits into our diets. Now, this might sound like a very simple recommendation, but there is a lot of science behind it. And in addition to all the nutrients that vegetables and fruits provide us with, they also provide us with a lot of fiber. Now, fiber, one of the main benefits of it is that it makes us feel full, but also fiber has been shown to promote the cultivation of good bacteria in our guts. There's a big science on the bacteria that we carry in our guts and their association with medical conditions and the diseases that we develop. So, for example, there has been studies on the type of bacteria that we carry in our guts, and these studies showed that depending on the type, they can increase our risk of having diabetes, hypertension, even cognitive conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's have been related to the type of bacteria that we carry in our guts. They did this really cool experiment where they took bacteria from the guts of obese mice and they inserted them into the guts of thin mice. And actually what happened is that the thin mice became obese as a result of the insertion of these bacteria.
Wow.
So there is science about this, and we should make it a goal to achieve the development of good bacteria in our guts to prevent or at least decrease our risk from having many medical conditions in the future. That was my fourth tip. My fifth tip for today is that we need to do a detox every once in a while. I recommend doing a detox. And nowadays, detox diets are very popular. There are detox drinks, detox smoothies. I have a very simple and affordable detox for everyone, and that is fasting. We can either do the Islamic fast. We can fast, for example, 2 days a week. There's also intermittent fasting. And the difference between intermittent fasting and the Islamic fast is that during the hours where we are fasting, we can be drinking. So we can be drinking things like coffee, tea, water, things basically that have no calories and no additives in them. And the most popular intermittent fasting that's done is called the 16 and 8, which stands for 16 hours of fasting, but we can be drinking those items I mentioned. And we are fasting for these 16 hours, and we are eating in that 8-hour window. So that is the most popular type of intermittent fasting. Another very interesting point about intermittent fasting is that it's also related to those bacteria that I just mentioned earlier. Fasting has also been shown to cultivate good bacteria in our guts. So that is another really good reason to fast.
Yeah,
And
everything's
detox our
connected.
bodies. Yes, for sure. And my sixth tip for today is to look at our personal triggers and personal habits. Because personal habits, when we do something on a daily basis, at the end it will add up. So for example, if on my way to work every day I pick up a Frappuccino, by the end of the year, that's like 300 Frappuccinos, and that's a lot of sugar and a lot of calories, and eventually that will also have a toll on my body. If, for example, at work, they bring lunch every day, and that lunch is not necessarily healthy, it was brought from a restaurant, and I don't know what was put in it, and I'm doing this on a daily basis, instead of bringing my own lunch from home and knowing exactly what I'm eating, that also will eventually contribute to the possibility of gaining weight and developing some other health problems as a result. So looking at personal habits is very important. Looking at personal triggers, I know you will talk about things like when we are emotional about something, or when we are stressed and we go and we reach for certain food items. So I'll leave that part for you. But the one thing I do want to mention is that the best way not to have something or not to eat something is by not having it around you. So for example, let's say I had a very stressful day and I feel like I want to have ice cream. It's one thing to go buy a cone of ice cream and just be done with it, versus going and buying a box of ice cream that I put in the freezer. And now every day, at the end of the day, when I'm stressed out, I will go and reach to that box and eat from it.
Yep.
So this is my recommendation for people who have these triggers is, okay, if you want to have something unhealthy, try not to make it a habit.
Yeah. Don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry.
Yeah. Maybe drink some water, fill your stomach with some water. That will control some of the hunger cravings.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
My seventh tip for achieving a healthy weight is about exercise. We can't talk about a healthy lifestyle without talking about exercise. When it comes to losing weight, nutrition plays or diet plays a bigger role than exercise. It depends on the body. Some people respond to exercise a lot better than others. However, for the majority of people, diet is a more important component to lose weight than exercise. But we should not underestimate the effect of exercise because one thing that happens as we get older is that we start to lose muscle mass. And our muscle mass has an effect on our basal metabolic rate. So the more muscle we have in our body, the higher our basal metabolic rate, and therefore the more we burn. So by really exercising and building that muscle tone in our bodies, we are really building a deposit for the future for that when basal metabolic rate starts to decrease. Hopefully, we will able to counteract that with having more muscle mass. Exercise has a lot more benefits than just that, but I just wanted to share that one aspect of exercise.
Yeah, I think people, when they think of exercise, they often think about it as like the aerobic exercise where you're just running and doing things like that. But they forget that strength training, like you mentioned, also has a huge impact on our body's metabolism and losing weight through that stronger metabolism as well.
Exactly. There are so many different types of exercise that could be, a whole session on its own. So like you said, there is aerobic exercise like running and brisk walking and things like that. There's also resistance training, weightlifting, and then there's also just doing stretching. Even stretching, also as we get older, our joints get stiffer. So just by doing stretching, we are building a deposit for the future. My eighth tip for today is other factors that we don't necessarily think about as an important component of living a healthy lifestyle, and that includes stress, which I know you will be talking about that, so I'm not gonna go too deep into that. But when we are chronically stressed, we have a chronic release of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and in the long run, cortisol is a steroid, and like all steroids, they can increase our predisposition to gaining weight. So we need to work on stress management as part of achieving a healthy lifestyle. And the other factor that people don't think much about is actually sleep. There are very clear studies that link sleep or lack of sleep to unhealthy weight and the development of many health conditions such as diabetes and hypertension. So these were the 8 tips that I have for achieving a healthy weight and avoiding that cycle of gaining and losing. And mostly they were physical aspects. And we know that there's a lot of mental aspect in weight management and on the other end of the spectrum, which is eating disorders. So we're going to shift gears toward you, Yasmeen, and if you can let us know about the mental aspect component of weight management and how much does that play a role?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, as you mentioned, they're definitely intertwined. Stress and eating definitely go together in many different ways. So a lot of times people will turn to food for comfort. Let's say they're having a bad day and they're really stressed out. They might end up overeating later that day. So it can be a form of an escape, and it also can be a form of self-soothing, right? food comforts us. So sometimes when we don't have maybe support in our life, or we're going through something emotionally, food is our companion at times.
Especially sweets.
Oh yeah, yeah. So we all at one point have had a stressful day, and then we go home and we realize that we're reaching for those foods like sweets or fatty foods or salty foods. And if we think about this on a brain chemistry level, when we're depleted in these happy chemicals like dopamine or serotonin, our body wants to reach that balance, right? And in technical terms or medical terms, it's called homeostasis. So we'll reach for these foods when we're low on our chemicals like dopamine, to just get to that balanced state again. And then you can also, relate this to cortisol, like you mentioned, because when you're stressed, cortisol is high, it's increased. And increased cortisol, as you mentioned, increases appetite, increases cravings for salty, sweet foods. So there's definitely a connection on a brain chemistry level between stress.
Food addictions are real.
Oh, yeah, definitely, yeah. I think, just like regular addiction, right? You can see that on a brain chemistry level. And there was a study I wanted to mention that I came across a few years ago that was really eye-opening for me. It was by the Institute for Psychology of Eating, and they found that just feeling guilty while eating a food will lead to a decreased metabolic rate of absorbing that food. So you can have two people eating the same amount of a chocolate cake, same portion, but if one of those people are feeling guilty while they're eating it, they might even store more of those calories as fat, which is incredible to think about, right? Just what's going on emotionally can affect these physical processes.
So if you're going to eat the cake, just enjoy it.
Yeah, just don't worry, moderation, right? Don't indulge in it every day, but we shouldn't hold ourselves back from indulging sometimes. So yeah, so these are just a few examples, right, of how we really can't separate emotional health and weight management. There's also a few studies that really draw the connection between trauma and obesity. So they found that there was a study in Sweden that found childhood abuse leads to a marked increase in developing obesity as an adult. And there was another study where they looked at 57,000 women, and they found that those who experienced physical or sexual abuse as children were twice as likely to be addicted to food than those who did not. So there is definitely a strong connection between trauma and becoming obese.
So how about the numbers? What do we know about the numbers or statistics in terms of the prevalence of these eating disorders in both the adults and the adolescent population?
Yeah, so I couldn't really find the breakdown between adolescents and adults, but what I found is that 9% of the worldwide population has an eating disorder. So it's definitely a significant amount. And what was also interesting is that 95% of those with eating disorders are ages 13 to 25, and they're female. So this is something that's predominantly affecting young women. Yeah. And then, these statistics, they don't account for the spectrum, right? Because to have an eating disorder, it means you have to qualify for that, in the diagnostic statistical manual for psychology. So it requires a lot to be diagnosed with that. It has to be very severe, very frequent. It has to really be affecting your functioning, which I'll talk about a little later. But what's in between that, right, on the spectrum is disordered eating. And this is something that a lot of us have some habits of, is, these eating habits that become maybe restrictive, compulsive, irregular, things like fasting very often, right? Fasting is good, but if you're doing it every day or something like that, binge eating, skipping meals, right? These are some things that, or some behaviors that can indicate that maybe your eating has become a little bit, not necessarily healthy, kind of abnormal, right?
So you're not talking about eating disorders, you're talking about disordered eating, which sounds more like a dysfunctional type of eating,
yeah,
or maybe the early phases of an eating disorder.
Yeah, exactly. You stated it very well. So disordered eating is, habits that if you continue to kind of start to obsess and engage in them frequently, can manifest as an eating disorder. So if you were to think of it as a spectrum, disordered eating would be like the less severe. You know, you might not fully qualify for an eating disorder, but there are some, you know, habits
Beginning
that,
signs.
yeah, that are putting you at risk. Yeah.
Okay. So those were numbers in the adult and the adolescents, and yeah, it's shocking that 95% of those individuals actually present from, you said 15 to 20?
13 to 25
13 to
females.
25,
Yeah.
How about when it comes to other demographics like geographical region? For example, you know, in our community, coming from a Middle Eastern community, what do we know about numbers or statistics in the Middle Eastern community in comparison with the rest of the world?
Yeah, so the sad part about this is that there's really not a lot of research based on just, you know, my own research. I wasn't able to find much, especially when it comes to Arab Americans, you know, Arabs living in America. But there were a couple studies. There was a study that was done in Egypt with 500 school-age girls, and they found that 1.6 of the girls were bulimic and 0.5 were anorexic, which is nearly identical to the U.S. rates. So they didn't find much of a difference there. But there was another study that was done at the UAE, or in the UAE at Al Ain University, and they surveyed 900 teenage Arab girls and found that a whopping 75% were unsatisfied with the way that they look. So there's definitely something going on here, right? We're definitely having issues with self-image and weight, right?
Body image, yeah.
Yeah, and I think,
body image.
right, I think because of maybe a stigma to talk about these things, right? A lot of times Arabs will see it as purely a physical thing, just like with a lot of, you know, mental health things. It's hard to see that, okay, there's more to it than physical. So I think, you know, working on that stigma a little bit might invite more research and things like that. And another thing I wanted to point out was, you know, culture definitely affects these rates as well, like what's going on in the culture. And if you're to see things, you know, changing over time, right, in the past, in a lot of Arab countries, there wasn't a lot of westernization. So they found that there's a positive correlation between how westernized an Arab country is and their eating disorder rates. So the more westernized, the more higher eating disorders, rates of eating disorders. So, you know, that just goes to show the influence of the media, right, and that thin ideal that is being presented to us, and how that affects the psyche and how that affects our habits and really just impacts it in a negative way, our eating habits.
Yeah, body perception and what we consider to be, you know, is being overweight a good thing or a bad thing, really, like you said, has a lot to do with the geographical region that you come from. In addition, it changes a lot with time.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I'm part Egyptian, and I know in Egypt, for a while now, I think it's changing because now there is definitely a stronger influence of the media, Western culture more recently. But in the past, being overweight was actually a positive thing. It showed that you were wealthy. It showed that, you know, you were healthy and you had money. So, you know, being overweight was okay. You know, it was accepted and there was nothing wrong with it. But again, as it becomes more westernized, that's starting to change a little bit.
Yeah. So, like all health conditions, not everyone will develop a health condition. There are certain risk factors that predispose an individual to have a health condition, including mental conditions. So what are some risk factors that predispose someone to having or developing an eating disorder?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of times people want that one answer, but with risk factors for eating disorders, there's really so many different things that play a role. One of them is genetic, so there are certain genes that could affect hunger, body weight, the feeling of fullness, and that definitely can play a role. When it comes to psychological aspects, there's low self-esteem, right? Obviously, if you're feeling not too great about yourself, you might want to like restrict, for example, and you might want to lose weight to just feel better about yourself. And there's also that need for self-control. So we find with anorexia in particular that a lot of what, pushes someone to develop something like that, like an eating disorder, would be to be able to control things, right? If you grew up, maybe there was a lot of trauma in your childhood where you felt out of control. Now you have something that you can control. Your whole day revolves around restricting, counting calories. It's really about feeling like I'm in control of my weight, and I can be very thin and I can control that. So there's the control, there's, that's it for the psychological actually. And then there's the sociocultural aspect, which is, like I was talking about earlier, that thin body ideal that we see in the media, that definitely influences us. And it's not just the media, it's also our friends, our family, the comments that we hear about weight. I know since coming to Dearborn, moving here, there's a lot of comments that people make about like losing weight. I'm on this diet, I'm trying this, right? It's a frequent topic. So when we're hearing it a lot, it's kind of like, oh, should I be thinking about this? Should I be worrying about this? We're human beings, so we're going to be influenced by what we're hearing. And then there's also that abundant food supply. So America is a little different than some Middle Eastern countries in that we have this abundant food supply. We have options. Everywhere we go, we're seeing ads about food, right? So that natural relationship that we have with food is just like in the Middle East where it's like, I'm hungry, I'm going to eat.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to have my meals every day. Like here, it's kind of, we make it a little bit more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have all these diets, as you mentioned earlier, right? So it creates this like obsessive, unnatural relationship with food that they found to be a risk factor for eating disorders.
Mm-hmm. And also, this lack of consensus on, what type of diet is best, and the different recommendations and conflicting information, such as, for example, the recommendation of having to eat 3 meals a day and snacks in between. That's like, 5 times that we're eating per day. Where is there any science behind this? No, there is no science behind this. So that adds also to the confusion when you have conflicting recommendations being given.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like any health conditions, it's a multi-pronged approach and multiple risk factors that predispose someone to having an eating disorder. But how can we pick up on the signs that someone is having an eating disorder? Because really that could be anyone from our family members, from our friends. So what are some things that we need to be on the lookout for?
Sure. So again, there's a difference between disordered eating and eating disorder. So I want to start there just to highlight those differences so that we can know like what, how serious of the problem it is. With disordered eating, with eating disorders, it really comes down to frequency and severity. So, how often are you engaging in these habits such as binging, purging, restricting, right? And how severe is it? How much are you restricting, for example? So having an eating disorder means that you qualify under the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Psychology for that clinical diagnosis. And that has to be done by a psychologist. So it really just depends on how severe is that disordered eating. Has it come to the point where it's affecting your overall functioning, where you're having frequent obsessive thoughts about food, and maybe you've had a significant change in your weight? Maybe a large part of your day just revolves around these habits, right? The binging, purging, counting calories, excessive exercising. These are all things that kind of indicate that it's become a little bit more severe, right? And that the disordered eating may have spiraled and become an eating disorder.
Okay. So it starts with early signs, and then it ends with the severe end, which is a full-blown eating disorder at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And finally, how can we prevent eating disorders, and how can we treat them?
Yeah, so I'll start with prevention. Prevention is really, it can be so many different things. But I want to speak to the Arab community because I know a lot of them will be listening to this podcast today. And we do have a very unhealthy relationship, I think, with food. And a lot of times we make comments about each other's weight. And of course, the older generation is going to do that. Like, it's just part of the culture. And maybe we can't change the way that they, make those comments. But in terms of the younger generation, I noticed that they also make these comments as well. And it might not be as in your face, but it's talked about a lot. It's like overly talked about. And, let's say if you comment on someone who's lost weight and say, oh, you lost weight, like we think it's a compliment. But in reality, they could be sick. They could have lost weight because they have an eating disorder. So I would say just try and avoid any comments related to weight.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
It's becoming a very sensitive subject.
It is, yeah. And sometimes all it takes is that one comment to take someone over the edge. I've seen that in my own clinical experience with one client where it was just one comment that the doctor made, and that set the stage for her eating disorder, So just be mindful of the things that are coming out of your mouth. And
like you said, it could be a trigger, but there's still multiple factors that are involved.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was things that had set the stage, and then that one trigger, and then that could have just set off, those habits to begin. And then I would also say, with regards to social media, we've talked a little bit about the influence, right, that it has on us. So I would say, be mindful of who you're following and how that's making you feel about yourself. And, being healthy is great, but like, are you taking it too far? Are you obsessing about it? Are you following all these accounts that are, showing it to you in your face every day as you're scrolling? So trying to create that balance where it doesn't become excessive, because anything that's excessive just makes you vulnerable to developing an actual disorder. And then avoiding, like you mentioned, these diets, right? They're very restrictive, and whenever you restrict, you end up binging. So as you mentioned, it's just not sustainable. For long term, it's not going to be helpful. So therapy, right? Therapy is something that is really going to help you get to the root cause, because if you're overeating, if you're binging, or if you're restricting, a lot of times these behaviors come from a feeling of insecurity. Maybe there's some trauma or some things that you haven't processed that you're using food to cope with. So go to therapy, if you feel that you need it and it could benefit you. And you might find that your eating just becomes more healthy once you start working on the emotional stuff.
Yeah. At what point should one refer someone to a therapist for something like this? When should someone see a therapist?
Yeah, again, I mean, it really boils down to function. Like, is your eating habits, are your eating habits affecting, your day-to-day? Like, are you finding that you won't go out to eat with friends because you're so concerned about the calories? Is it affecting your work? You know what I mean? So once you notice it affecting different parts of your life, it's affecting your functioning, then that's a red flag. Like, okay, this is becoming a problem. Like, I should get some help with this.
You're overly obsessing, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's taking up a lot of your thoughts throughout the day, things like that, like here and there, if it's happening, you're having these like disordered eating habits that I mentioned before, that could be, I wouldn't say normal, but maybe not a cause for like extreme concern. But
yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So these were some of the mental aspects of weight management and eating disorders. And I spoke about the physical aspects of living a healthy lifestyle. Since this is a faith initiative, we should also mention that from an Islamic perspective, our body is a trust that we were entrusted with, and we are to take the best care of it that we can. And relating to what you mentioned about body image and self-appreciation, we are reminded in the Quran that we have been created in the best of form, and therefore, as a creation of God, we are to have that self-acceptance and self-respect, as long as we are striving to live a healthy lifestyle. This concludes our session for today. We really hope that This will benefit our audience. We hope to present more sessions like these in the future. And we would like to thank everyone who helped this program come to fruition, from the Faith Community Health Initiative, as well as the tech team that's with us today. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you all so much. Wa alaikum assalam.